Imagine discovering your great-grandmother never legally existed. No birth certificate, no marriage license, no land deed, no proof she was ever here. You search archives, you check state records, you contact local offices. Nothing. It's as if your bloodline ends in smoke. Now imagine learning. It wasn't a clerical mistake. It was a fire, and it happened thousands of times across America for many families. Ancestry research follows a clean line: birth, marriage, property, death, until suddenly it stops, not because the person vanished, but because the records did. Across the 1800s and the early 1900s, courthouses, the buildings that stored birth records, marriage certificates, wills, land deeds, tax rolls, criminal files, burned at alarming rates, and when they burned, entire communities lost their legal memory. Families lost proof of land, ownership. Widows lost proof of marriage. Children lost proof of inheritance. Veterans lost proof of service. In some cases, entire counties were reduced to blank pages in history. And once the paper was gone, so were the people in 19th century America. Courthouse fires were shockingly common. Wooden buildings, oil lamps, paper archives, stacked floor to ceiling. Fires happened, but the frequency raises questions. By some historical estimates, over 1,300 county courthouses experienced major fires in the 1800s. Some were accidents, lightning strikes, heating stoves, faulty chimneys, but others happened at very convenient times, right before debt trials, right before land disputes, right before tax audits, and in several cases, right after controversial elections. Entire record rooms would go up in flames overnight, sometimes with no witnesses, sometimes with doors locked from the inside, sometimes with the only surviving documents being the least controversial ones. And when investigators arrived, there was nothing left to examine. Ash doesn't testify in 1877. In a southern county still recovering from the Civil War, a courthouse burned to the ground. Inside were emancipation records, land, ownership filings, freedmen's labor contracts, marriage registrations for formerly enslaved families. When the fire ended, so did proof. For newly freed black families, those documents weren't paperwork. They were protection, without contracts. Land claims could be disputed without marriage records. Legal rights were questioned without documentation. Families could be pushed off property they worked for years to secure. Many were, and they had no way to fight back, because the evidence that proved their existence was smoke. In another Midwestern county in the 1880s, the courthouse caught fire just weeks before dozens of foreclosure hearings. Local farmers were drowning in debt. Banks were preparing seizures. But when the building burned, mortgage records vanished. Some debts disappeared. Others were conveniently reconstructed. Land ownership became chaotic, and in the confusion, large portions of property shifted hands. Was it sabotage? Insurance fraud? A desperate act? No one could prove anything because the proof was gone. The pattern wasn't isolated. During Reconstruction, during economic panics, during land redistribution conflicts, courthouses burned not all at once, not in one state, but repeatedly and almost always. The most sensitive records were stored in the most vulnerable rooms, paper and wooden cabinets. No fireproof safes, no backups, no duplicates. Sometimes the vault survived, but the records inside DN, sometimes only certain years were lost, sometimes only land deeds, sometimes only criminal indictments. In multiple documented cases, fires started in record rooms, not kitchens, not heating areas. And once again, Ash doesn't testify. Insurance payouts followed, political careers continued, and communities were told it was unfortunate. But for families, its legal identity depended on those pages. It wasn't unfortunate, it was catastrophic. Imagine trying to prove you own your land. Without a deed, imagine trying to claim inheritance. Without a will, imagine trying to prove your marriage. Without a certificate, for many women in the 19th century, property rights depended entirely on documented marital status. When records burned, widows struggled to claim estates. Some lost everything. For immigrants, citizenship filings were sometimes stored locally. Without those records, legal status could be questioned. For Native communities, treaty-related documentation and land agreements were often archived in local offices. When those burned, so did leverage. And for formerly enslaved families, whose identities had already been suppressed for generations, the destruction of records meant history. Erased them twice, once in life and once in paper. The fire didn't just destroy wood and ink. It destroyed continuity. It cut genealogical lines in half. It created what researchers now call record voids. Entire decades where documentation simply does not exist. To modern historians, these are gaps to families living through it. They were disasters. By the early 1900s, awareness of this problem grew. Fireproof vaults became more common. Duplicate records were stored in separate locations. States began archiving centrally because too much had already been lost, but the damage was permanent. If your family lived in a county that experienced one of these fires, your history may have ended abruptly, not because your ancestors vanished, but because the evidence did today. Genealogists still hit walls in certain regions. Entire family trees that stop in the 1870s, or the 1880s, or the 1890s. And when they trace the reason, they find a familiar phrase in county histories. Records destroyed by courthouse fire. One sentence. That erases generations. Think about what that means. Your ancestor may have fought in wars, built farms, raised children, paid taxes, married, worked, lived an entire life, and yet on paper, they are barely traceable. Not because they were insignificant, but because the building that held their proof. Burned history doesn't just forget people naturally. Sometimes it forgets them violently, and sometimes forgets them conveniently. If your ancestry seems to disappear in the late 1800s, if your family tree hits a sudden wall, if a name exists in stories but nowhere in documents, it may not be mystery, it may be smoke. And courthouse fires weren't the only way records disappeared. Some weren't destroyed by flames at all. Some were removed quietly, stamped, confidential, locked away, or intentionally erased. But that's a different story. Perfect. I'm not going to just add words. Going to extend the tension, deepen the pattern, and introduce one more disturbing dimension without breaking retention. This continues naturally after the sequel tease section, expanding the story for another approximately 7 minutes of runtime. You have to understand what records meant in the 1800s. Today, your identity exists in dozens of digital systems, government databases, hospital systems, tax records, bank archives. Your existence is duplicated everywhere. But in the 19th century, your life might exist in only one place. One ledger, one shelf, one room. If that room burned, you were reduced to memory, and memory doesn't hold up in court. Most counties kept original records and handwritten books. There were no photocopies, no digital backups, no cloud storage. If a courthouse clerk recorded your marriage in 1868, that single book might be the only proof it ever happened. If that book burned in 1872, your marriage legally evaporated. And in an era when property, inheritance, and legitimacy depended on paperwork, that was more than inconvenience. It was vulnerability. In some states, property passed strictly through documented lineage, without proof of birth or marriage. Inheritance claims could collapse. Entire estates shifted simply because paper turned to ash, and in legal disputes, Whoever could produce documentation often won, if one side's records burned. Power shifted instantly. The Civil War didn't just reshape the nation politically, it shattered record systems. Courthouses in border states and southern regions were frequently targeted, abandoned, or destroyed. Some fires were accidental, some were wartime damage, some were never explained, but the effect was enormous. After emancipation, millions of formerly enslaved people attempted to establish legal identity. Marriage, registrations surged, labor contracts were documented, land purchases were filed. For many, this was the first time their lives were formally recorded. Then in some counties, the records burned. And when they did, fragile new legal protections disappeared. It became easier to challenge land ownership, easier to dispute wages defer, to erase claims. A second erasure, this time through fire. Another uncomfortable detail emerges when historians examine patterns. Many courthouses were heavily insured, and fires sometimes occurred during financial strain, when counties were bankrupt, when officials were under scrutiny, when tax audits loomed in several documented cases. Insurance claims followed swiftly after fires. New courthouses were built, modernized, upgraded, but the records inside the old ones, gone forever? Was it coincidence? Negligence? Desperation? There isn't always proof of wrongdoing, but the timing, in certain cases, raises eyebrows. And when records are destroyed, investigation becomes nearly impossible, because evidence requires paper, and paper burns. Genealogists today often speak of burned counties, entire counties known in research circles as black holes of documentation. If your ancestors lived there during a specific decade, your search may simply end. Not because they moved, not because they changed names, but because the documentation ceased to exist. It's why some family histories are richly detailed, and others fade into rumor. Two families could live in neighboring counties, one preserved in archives, the other erased by flame. The difference? A single night, a single spark, a single building. We often think of history as permanent, as recorded, as stable. But for the people living through these disasters, the impact was immediate and personal. Imagine a widow walking to the courthouse to prove her marriage, only to find charred ruins. Imagine a farmer trying to prove he paid his taxes for years. With nothing left to show, imagine standing in front of a judge, knowing the document that protected you no longer exists, and the court telling you there's no record. 3 words, no record. For some, that meant starting over. For others, it meant losing everything. In rare but documented cases, courthouse fires occurred near local elections, ballots stored in county buildings, voter registrations, archived in filing rooms, and when buildings burned, so did oversight Reconstruction era. Politics were volatile, power struggles were intense, control of land and representation hung in the balance. When records disappeared, accountability often disappeared with them. And once again, proof was impossible, because ash cannot be cross-examined by the late 19th century. Awareness spread. Too many counties had lost too much. Architects began designing fireproof, vaults, thick iron doors, stone construction, separate. Archive rooms. Some counties even began storing duplicates in neighboring towns. But reforms came after the damage. Thousands of fires had already occurred. Millions of documents already lost, countless personal histories already fractured, and no system could restore what had been destroyed decades earlier. There's another layer to this story. When documentation vanishes, narratives can be rewritten. If land ownership records burn, boundaries can shift. If criminal records burn, reputations can be reset. If debt ledgers burn, obligations disappear. And in the absence of documentation, whoever controls the new records controls the story. That doesn't mean every fire was intentional. Many were accidents. But the consequences of those accidents were profound. History is shaped by what survives. And when survival depends on paper, fire becomes a powerful force. If you've ever tried to trace your ancestry and found a blank space, if you've ever seen the phrase records destroyed in a county archive note, if you've ever wondered why your family history fades in the 1800s, it may not be because your ancestors were insignificant. It may be because their proof didn't. Survive, they lived, they worked, they loved, they struggled. But the building that held their story didn't, and once the pages were gone, so was the certainty. History remembers what it can hold. And sometimes, it can't hold much at all. Courthouse. Fires weren't just structural disasters. They were identity disasters. They didn't just burn wood and ink. They burned continuity. They severed lineage. They erased leverage, and they left behind something far more difficult to extinguish. Doubt, because when the records disappear, so does the line between accident and convenience, and that uncertainty still lingers in the smoke. The sequel script about records erased without fire.